Hello, I'm Leigh Hatcher from HammondCare Public Affairs in conversation with Professor John Swinton, Professor in Practical Theology and Pastoral Care in the School of Divinity, History and Philosophy at the University of Aberdeen. John is also working with HammondCare on spirituality and spiritual practice relating to older people, particularly those living with dementia. John, thanks again so much for joining us. In this, our third conversation, I'd like to focus in on the whole concept of spiritual care. It's more and more becoming recognised as a necessary element of care in the medical world. That's a change, isn't it?
It's a shift, yeah. I mean, it's a shift from understanding illness simply as a medical thing to understanding it as a personal thing. So it's a positive shift within the systems.
Why has it needed to shift to that, to include spiritual as well as physical care?
Well, I think that the general consensus on that point would be that within a highly technicalised biomedical system, it's very tempting to turn everything into technological challenges and to move away. One way you could put it is modern people have a tendency to turn mystery into puzzles and then try to solve them. And there is a real element of mystery about being a human being, being an emotional person, being somebody that falls in love, being somebody that encounters illness and then having all that stuff challenged. There's something quite mysterious about that, and it's not simply there to be solved, it's there to be understood. And I think that's the reason why people are beginning to push back against particular understandings of or interpretations of illness.
What is it about the human condition that means we have to recognise spiritual care?
Well, human beings are complicated creatures. We live in the world in a multitude of different dimensions, and we experience the world in various ways. We are inherently relational creatures. We cannot survive without being in right relationship. We are creatures that require some sense of direction and purpose and meaning. And we ask questions that no other creature asks. So we are recognisably different about the way we encounter the world. And I think spirituality, spiritual care, is an acknowledgement of that differentness, an acknowledgement of the uniqueness of human beings, and a powerful statement to say that we want to recognise that and stand in solidarity with you as you work through what that means.
Does a spiritual life need to be a religious life?
That depends on whether you think spirituality exists or not. See, the way I think about spirituality is this. When you look at the literature on spirituality, particularly spirituality in nursing, every definition of spirituality that you see will be different, right? And there's no particular reason for that difference other than the fact that the nurse researcher quite likes that. So it's very rare to have a philosophical or a theological basis for what spirituality is. In other words, people make it up in order to emphasise particular things that they think are important within the healthcare system. Now, at one level, then, you could say that spirituality just doesn't exist. It's something that human beings make up. But at another level, it does some work. In other words, it raises people's consciousness to the significance of meaning and purpose and value and hope, these things which are central to who we are as human beings. So even though it doesn't exist, in a kind of real conceptual sense, it exists in a practical sense. It's a practical concept that finds its meaning wherever it is placed, right? So religious traditions are much easier to identify because they have their own narratives and rituals and they have their own communities. So therefore it's much easier to look at and identify a religious spirituality, and also to identify whether or not that may be helpful for people. So if you look at the literature on religion and health, there's a good deal of literature that suggests that being a religious person is good for your health. But the most convincing evidence is that being in community is good for your health, and that having solid stories helps you to cope with and explain horrible things when they happen to you. So there's two different ways. One doesn't exist but does something, and then something here that's more concrete and tangible but also does something.
In the context of spiritual care, the person offering that care will have their own spiritual framework. It can be a tricky thing for them if they are feeling they need to win over the person for whom they're caring to their particular point of view or framework.
Yeah, well, spiritual care is not proselytization. It's not a matter of try and persuade somebody that what I believe is your belief. It's a way of learning how to love people in a personal and a professional context. To see them differently, to look at them differently, to be with them differently, and to understand the story differently. It's not to do with you, it's to do with how you are together.
Can you give us a practical example of what good spiritual care will be and what good spiritual care isn't?
Well, I can give you an idea or a way of thinking about it that might be helpful. Now, some of my colleagues would completely disagree with what I'm about to say, but I don't think spiritual care has to do with learning a new set of competencies. It's learning to look at the competencies and practices that you have and see them differently. So if you take something like pain. Now, what does pain do? Pain fills your body, fills your universe. When you're in pain, you can't think of anything other than the pain. You know, even for a minor pain, it just nags and nags and nags, and it distracts you. You can't think of anything. Pain's the enemy of community, as Stanley Hauerwas once put it. But pain is also the enemy of God, because you can't think about God when you're in absolute agony. And so, within that context, giving pain medication, good pain medication, is a spiritual practice, because it releases somebody to get back in touch with God, to get back in touch with the community, and to begin to find who their true identity in the midst of that. So the everyday, what looks like a really technical pharmacological practice, giving people complicated medications, is actually a deeply spiritual practice. And if we begin to think about everything that we do on a day-to-day basis, whether we're bathing somebody, whether we're changing somebody, whether we're just having conversations over coffee, as spiritual practices, then I think you begin to see that you're not simply learning to do spiritual care, but you're learning to create spiritual environments where spirituality becomes just a natural thing to do.
My guess is, as a teacher and leader in this whole arena of spiritual care, you've learnt a tremendous amount yourself. What would be the biggest lesson you'd say you've learnt about spiritual care?
About spiritual care? Yeah. Is it's not an option. It feels like an option and something that looks like an option, but it's not an option. If you want to care well, you cannot omit these dimensions that people describe as spiritual. Whether that's religious or not religious, take that out, and what do you think you're doing?
For the last few years, you've been working with the Scottish Government on a service called the Chaplaincy Listening Service.
Yes.
Give us a sense of what that does and what it means.
Yeah, it's an initiative that my good friend Ewan Kelly has been running through, and it's been running out of the University of Aberdeen. Effectively, what it suggests is that very often when people come along to general practitioners, family practitioners, they don't have anything obviously wrong with them. Sometimes they can have, vague pains, vague aches, but they're not quite sure why they're there. They just know they've got to be there. Well, within that context, GPs started to notice or suggest or frame these as spiritual needs, that actually there's something more existential and spiritual going on than simply the medical reason that they came. And so in response to that, we have put chaplaincy listeners in all of the family practices across the country. And when somebody comes along like that, the GP family practitioner, I don't know what you guys call it.
GP,
yeah. They refer to this person to the spiritual listener. And the spiritual listener just listens. Right? They're not counsellors, they're not trying to do anything, they just simply listen. And what's fascinating about it is that people have really been moved and helped by that. Just like when you hear your own story articulated, you begin to get a different perspective on it. Right? And so after 2 or 3 visits, people don't come back, but they report it as being a really helpful thing to do. So that's what we've been up to, just creating spaces for listening, spiritual spaces for listening. Which, and that also means that for chaplains, for example, that chaplaincy doesn't just stop at the door of the hospital. It means it now moves into a broader context, not in a kind of proselytizing way, but it means that these ideas that have been developed within healthcare have an opportunity to be in communities and to help inform healing spaces within communities where people just find the world different.
Great stuff. Professor John Swinton, thank you so much indeed for joining us again.
Yeah.